Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're getting into a really complex and I think morally challenging piece of 20th century history. We're looking at how a small, American-based religious group managed to navigate, well, life and death under Adolf Hitler's regime. This is our deep dive into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LDS Church, and the Third Reich from 1933 to 1945.
It's a truly remarkable story, and it's mostly a story of institutional survival. You have to picture the scene. It's January 1933, Hitler seizes power, and the German LDS community is tiny, maybe 8,000 members.
Just 8,000. And they're not seen as a mainstream faith, are they?
Not at all. To the Nazi state and to a lot of the public, they were a Sekte. That's a German word that means basically a sect or a cult, a foreign, suspicious group.
So that immediately puts them in a vulnerable position,
Yeah.
right in the crosshairs. And researchers who've studied this say the church leaders faced, well, three impossible choices, like three doors.
That's a great way to put it. The first door was open resistance. That's the path groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses took. And it led directly to persecution, being banned, and concentration camps.
Okay, so that's a dead end. What's door number two?
Ardent collaboration, just becoming completely pro-Nazi, aligning with the ideology to guarantee safety. But that would have cost them their principles, their entire future.
Which leaves door number three, the one they walk through.
Exactly. Political neutrality and accommodation. The idea was to comply with the laws of the land, no matter how oppressive, to ensure the physical survival of the church and its members.
And that's a tightrope walk, obeying the law without, losing your soul.
It is. And it involved everything from voluntary censorship of their own scriptures to, believe it or not, basketball.
Basketball. Okay, we definitely have to unpack that. But let's start with the foundation. How did they justify accommodating a dictatorship? What was the official line?
They built their entire strategy on a single piece of their own doctrine, the 12th Article of Faith. It states, "We believe in being subject to kings, presidents, rulers, and magistrates, in obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law."
And they used this with the Nazis.
They literally quoted it to the Gestapo. Mission leaders in Germany like Oliver Budge in 1933 and later Roy Welker went to the secret police and promised their church would stay politically neutral. No anti-state propaganda. Ever.
That feels tactical, for sure. But here's the question. How do you reconcile that article of faith with laws that are enabling systematic violence and oppression? I mean, isn't neutrality in that situation a form of tacit support?
And that is the central moral question of this whole story. For the leaders, the goal wasn't to challenge the state's morality. The goal was to preserve the ability for members to keep worshiping in Germany. In their view, if they spoke out, the church would just cease to exist there. Survival came first.
And you get the sense the Nazis were never really buying it. They were suspicious from the start, weren't they?
Oh, completely unconvinced. This accommodation strategy was purely defensive. We have a critical Gestapo memorandum from 1936 that is just chilling.
Yeah.
It explicitly warned mission leaders that if there was any anti-state propaganda, the strictest state police measures would be carried out against the sect.
So, not a suggestion, a threat.
A direct threat. And understanding that threat, that one wrong move could get everyone banned or worse, is the key to understanding all the painful compromises that came next.
Okay, let's talk about those compromises. Beyond just staying quiet, what did this accommodation actually look like on the ground before the war?
It meant getting rid of anything the Nazis might see as competition. For instance, the church had its own youth programs. They all had to go.
Because German youth were required to join the Hitler Youth.
Exactly. You couldn't have a competing organization. And missionary work was heavily restricted. Anything that even mentioned Zion, which could be seen as allegiance to a foreign place, was banned.
And that led to them censoring their own materials, which must have been a profound compromise.
It was. Church leaders were voluntarily editing their own books. The Apostle James E. Talmage wrote a core doctrinal study, the Articles of Faith. It was banned by the Nazis in July 1936. Missionaries were told to stop handing out tracts. Even certain hymns mentioning Zion were removed from services. They were literally cutting pages out of manuals.
Just to remove any possible objection from the state.
That's it. It shows how focused they were on simply enduring.
And there was a fascinating economic piece to this, too, that helped the American missionaries stay afloat.
Yes, the financial side. The Nazi economy was incredibly controlled. But the American missionaries, after some discussions with U.S. government leaders, were allowed to buy registered Deutschmarks at a very favorable exchange rate.
So it was almost like a subsidy. It let them stretch their American dollars way further in Germany.
Pretty much. It made the whole missionary program financially possible as the economy was tightening. It wasn't an official Nazi endorsement, of course, but it was a crucial, subtle lifeline that kept that American connection open until the missionaries were finally pulled out right before the war started in '39.
Okay, so that was the official survival playbook. But now we get to how this all looked to the outside world, because this is where accommodation starts to look a lot like cooperation.
It absolutely does, and the most famous example of this is what some have called basketball diplomacy. It revolves around the 1936 Berlin Olympics.
Right, the infamous Nazi Olympics. How on earth did basketball get involved?
Well, the German authorities were looking for qualified coaches for their national team. And it just so happened that the American LDS missionaries in Berlin were already playing and promoting the sport. They were good at it.
So the Nazis approached them, and the mission leaders saw this as a golden opportunity.
They did. Not as a political alignment, but as an opportunity for making friends. A way to show American sportsmanship and healthy living. So two missionaries actually spent a lot of time coaching the German national team for the Olympics. For the Nazis, it was good propaganda. For the church, it was good PR to keep the Gestapo off their backs.
It's just so strange, gaining favor with a fascist regime through basketball. But there was another area of common ground that was much more serious because it touched on the Nazis' horrific racial ideology, genealogy.
This is a really disturbing overlap. The Nazis were obsessed with genealogical research.
To prove Aryan ancestry for racial purity.
Exactly. And the church, of course, promotes it for a completely different reason, for temple ordinances for the dead.
So what happened when those two interests collided?
All of a sudden, government officials who had been suspicious and denied the Mormons access to vital records the church needed for its work, started showing them respect. The church was seen as this, rigorous records-keeping group, and this led some missionaries to actually believe they were becoming a favored church in the eyes of the state, just because their religious practice happened to align with a key Nazi policy.
That's chilling. That a shared interest in paperwork could give you protection from a state that's using those same records to plan mass murder.
It really highlights the surreal nature of what they were doing to survive. And that desire to find common ground somehow spilled over into, well, some really disturbing personal statements of support.
Right. We have records from mission leaders, like Roy Welker, who seemed genuinely impressed by Hitler.
He was. He wrote that he was persuaded by Hitler because he seemed to like the church. And he even praised Hitler's work with the youth and his goal of creating a superior race.
And his wife, Elizabeth, had a quote that's it's really stuck with me.
She acknowledged the anti-Semitism, but she still said, and I'm quoting here, "You may hate Hitler, but you have to acknowledge he is doing things." She went on to say, "His views on Jews may be wrong, but they are certainly sincere."
Certainly sincere. Wow, and you saw this at the local level too, members trying to draw these flimsy parallels between church teachings and Nazi ideals.
Yes, things like the church's health code, its strong hierarchy. They tried to find anything that looked similar. But the most infamous example of this came in 1939. The East German mission president, a man named Alfred C. Rees, published an article in the official Nazi Party newspaper.
Not just any paper, the Völkischer Beobachter. That's the highest level propaganda tool they had.
It is. To have your church profiled positively in that paper, that was the absolute peak of accommodation. It doesn't get much closer to collaboration than that.
Which brings us to that photo, the one that always circulates. It's the church president at the time, Heber J. Grant, speaking in 1937, and he's standing in front of a giant Nazi flag. What's the real story there?
The context is everything for that image. It was basically an unavoidable necessity. The meeting was in a rented hall in Frankfurt that was owned by the National Socialist Teachers League. And by 1937, the swastika was the official national flag of Germany. You couldn't hold a large public meeting in a public space without displaying it. It was required.
So it wasn't an endorsement of the party, it was just the flag of the country they were in.
Precisely. And the great irony is that at that very meeting, the Gestapo was there, monitoring him and taking notes on his entire speech.
And that brings us right back to the central point. Despite all of this, the Nazis never, ever trusted them. The compliance was a shield against a suspicion that was always there.
Always. The Nazi regime saw a fundamental ideological clash. Their own intelligence reports list several reasons for their deep suspicion, which proves they saw the accommodation as just a cover.
What were their main issues with the church?
Well, first and foremost, foreign influence. It was an American sect, so their loyalties were automatically in question. Second, this is crucial, was what they called Jewish sympathy.
Jewish sympathy. What did they mean by that?
They were deeply disdainful of the saints' use of the Old Testament. Their reports specifically noted that missionaries were sometimes housed in Jewish-owned buildings and were friendly with Jews. They even saw LDS practices like tithing and observing the Sabbath as evidence of strong Old Testament Jewish influences.
So, because the church's theology had roots in Judaism, the Nazis flagged them for potential persecution.
That's exactly right. And they also noted a real lack of political enthusiasm. Gestapo reports concluded there was no talk of a pro-German attitude. They noted that members would categorically refuse to use the German salute and showed no interest in political events. So this refusal to engage, which the church saw as neutrality, the Gestapo saw as a form of ideological resistance.
And this suspicion finally came to a head in a really terrifying moment recounted by a Hamburg district president named Otto Berndt. I think this one threat crystallizes the whole reason for the accommodation strategy.
It does. Berndt was being interrogated by the Gestapo, and the officer told him directly, "Make no mistake about it, Berndt, when we have this war behind us, and after we have eliminated the Jews, you Mormons are next."
That just stops you cold. You Mormons are next.
That single quote reframes everything. The censorship, the basketball, the silence. It wasn't just a strategic choice, it was an existential defense.
Absolutely. Without that context, the accommodation seems morally questionable. With it, you realize it may have been the only way to save 8,000 lives and the institution itself. And we should be clear. The official church never endorsed Nazism. In 1942, the first presidency formally condemned both Nazism and communism. But at the end of the day, the real story is defined by the choices made by individuals on the ground.
That's where the drama really is. And the data we have suggests most German saints were not pro-Nazi. Only about 2.5 to 5% were Nazi Party members. That's compared to about 10% of the general population. But within that small group, you see the entire spectrum of human morality. And we have to start with the hero of resistance, Helmut Hübener. He was a 17-year-old kid, an apprentice. He got access to a shortwave radio, listened to BBC broadcasts, and started writing and distributing anti-Nazi pamphlets.
A teenager. And he was caught and executed for treason in 1942. But the real tragedy, the institutional scandal, happened after he died.
It's just awful. To avoid more trouble with the Gestapo, Hübener was posthumously excommunicated by his own local branch president, a man named Arthur Zander. Zander was pro-Nazi, and the reason given for the excommunication was specifically to show that the church had nothing to do with the treason.
So they threw their own dead hero under the bus to protect the institution.
It was an act of institutional self-preservation at the cost of a young man's memory. It's profoundly disturbing.
And to their credit, the first presidency in Salt Lake City overturned that excommunication in 1948, but it shows the pressure these local leaders were under. We should also remember people like Paul Herbert Schick, another young saint who was arrested just for refusing to do the Nazi salute at work.
Yes. And then there's true, unambiguous heroism. People like Max Raschek, a branch president in Hanover. He is the example of individual righteousness that goes way beyond accommodation. During the horror of Kristallnacht in November 1938, he personally risked his own life to help a Jewish couple escape Germany and get safely to Switzerland.
A true hero. But then you have to confront the darkest side of this. The members who didn't just accommodate, but fully embraced the regime.
And the most disturbing case we have from the sources is a man named Erich Krause. Krause was an active, converted member of the church. He was also a dedicated Nazi Obergruppenführer in the SA, the Brown Shirts.
That's a very high paramilitary rank.
It is. He was the commandant of a Nazi prison. And the records confirm he personally tortured and murdered hundreds of people. He was involved in liquidating a Jewish ghetto.
And he was an active Latter-day Saint through all of this. How is that even possible?
That is the great mystery of complicity, isn't it? He taught his family the gospel. He attended church, apparently without seeing any contradiction between his faith and his role as a mass murderer. But maybe the most difficult part of his story is how his community treated him after the war.
Right. After the war, he was arrested for murder and crimes against humanity. What happened?
His local congregation visited him in prison. The mission president at the time, Walter Stover, vouched for his character. He even used 2,000 marks of church funds to pay his bail. Krause was eventually released. And later, he was called by the local German leadership to serve as a stake genealogist.
A stake genealogist? A man responsible for hundreds of murders. It's incomprehensible. It just shows a total moral breakdown at the local level after the war. Maybe they just couldn't grasp the scale of his crimes.
Or didn't want to. And this moral divide wasn't just in Germany. It existed at the very top of the church leadership in Salt Lake City.
Also.
Well, on one hand, you had prominent leaders like David O. McKay calling Hitler a murderous dictator and John A. Widtsoe calling him mentally ill. Very clear condemnations. But on the other hand, you had J. Reuben Clark, a very powerful counselor in the first presidency. He was known to hold personal anti-Semitic views, and there are reports he actively refused to help members of Jewish descent escape Germany by refusing to provide affidavits they needed.
That makes the whole story even more tangled. The official church is being threatened by the Nazis for Jewish sympathy, while one of its own top leaders holds anti-Semitic views.
It just shows the sheer scale of the moral crisis that totalitarianism creates. The history of the LDS Church in Nazi Germany is this agonizing tightrope walk. You have to remember, over 1,000 German saints died fighting in the German army because of conscription. They were victims too.
So, when you put it all together, the policy of accommodation, the individual heroism, the individual horror, what does it all mean?
I think the main lesson is that the official church never ever endorsed Nazism. But that institutional policy of survival required these painful compromises. Voluntary censorship, looking for superficial common ground, and using their own scripture in ways that it blurred the line between obedience and enabling an oppressor.
And I think this history reminds us that even when an organization is officially neutral, it's the moral compass of the people on the ground, whether they choose to be a Helmut Hübener, a Max Raschek, or an Erich Krause, that ultimately defines the character of that group in dark times. And leaves a question for you, the listener, to think about. When does obedience to the law of the land stop being a virtue and start becoming tacit support for oppression?